commandments for the environment, something that no one will be allowed to violate. Now, this is not the language of biblical morality. Rather, these are the cadences of totalitarian dictatorship. And that dictatorship will descend upon a prostrate and defenseless world should the empowerment of the United Nations continue. It is important to remember that the laws of divine nature, as interpreted by the UN, would have jurisdiction within the home, particularly in matters of population control. Under the UN's concept of what they call sustainable development, the human population is a resource to be managed by global supervisors. To understand how sustainable development works in practice, all one needs to do is to examine the case of communist China, which has enacted a policy forbidding couples to have more than one child without special permission from the government, and to have no more than 2 children in any case. The Chinese population program includes compulsory abortion, infanticide, and sterilization, and a steeply escalating scale of punishments for couples who have unauthorized children. Now, all of these programs are generously underwritten by the United Nations through its Fund for Population Activities, UNICEF, the UN Development Fund, and allied organizations such as the International Planned Parenthood Federation. Furthermore, this hideous program received an award from the United Nations Population Fund in 1983 and was commended by then Secretary General Javier Pérez de Cuellar as an example for the entire world. Now, although the Chinese regime's policies have inflicted unimaginable horrors upon women, the UN, in its wisdom, has chosen Beijing as the site of its 1995 World Conference on Women's Rights. Now, at the 1994 Population Control Conference in Cairo, the UN set forth the 20-year plan to stabilize the world's population, a terrifying prospect given the body's affinity for coercive population control. How would this stabilization be achieved? According to Jacques Cousteau, in remarks published in the UNESCO Courier, a UN publication, quote, "In order to stabilize world population, we must eliminate 350,000 people per day. It is a horrible thing to say," writes Cousteau, "but it's just as bad not to say it." Now, the key to the imposition of radical population control policies is the denial of parental rights and the substitution of the paternalism of the state. If children are the property of the state can regulate the number of children it permits to be born. This is the assumption which the UN has supported and subsidized in China and elsewhere, and it is also found in the proposal that parents be required to obtain a license from the state in order to enjoy the privilege of having children. This book, Licensing Parents, Can We Prevent Child Abuse and Neglect, was published in late 1994 by Dr. Jack Westman, a noted and influential children's rights activist. Now, according to Dr. Westman and the experts that he quotes, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child makes government, and not the parents, the primary custodian of the rights and interests of children. This interpretation, by the way, was confirmed to me in an interview I had with Dr. Richard Jolly, who at the time was the acting head of UNICEF. Once again, if the state is the primary custodian of children, why couldn't it require parents to obtain a license before they are permitted to have children? And furthermore, why couldn't the state seize children from parents it decides are unqualified? Article 9 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, as summarized by the United Nations, states, quote, "The child has a right to live with his or her parents unless this is deemed to be incompatible with the child's best interests." This is to say that under the terms of the convention, the state, which would define the best interests of children, could seize children from parents at whim. What might America look like if we were to ratify the convention and restructure our society accordingly? One possible future has been described by children's rights activist David Lycan of the University of Minnesota, who is a supporter of parental licensing and has created a blueprint for parental licensing. According to a sympathetic newspaper account of Lycan's proposal, we can find this scenario. Quote, "Under Lycan's system, if children were born to unlicensed parents, the state would intervene immediately. Licenses would be checked in hospital maternity wards. Unlicensed parents would lose their children permanently. Adoptions would be final and irreversible." Furthermore, according to Lycan himself, quote, repeat offenders might be required to submit to an implant of Norplant as a way to keep them from having another baby for 5 years. In other words, government sterilization as we see in communist China. For more than a quarter of a century, population control advocates have urged the UN and national governments to impose parental licensing programs for the purpose of rationing the so-called privilege of having children. This roster of misanthropes includes anti-natalist writers Paul Ehrlich, Edgar Chastain, and Garrett Hardin, Frederick Jaffe of the Planned Parenthood Federation, Bernard Berelson of the Population Council, World Bank advisor Norman Myers, Kenneth Boulding, an economist who was an advisor to the League of Nations, and Sir Roy Calm, a noted British surgeon and supposed humanitarian. All these individuals have endorsed compulsory abortion and sterilization and other repellent measures to ensure parental compliance with parental licensing programs. And as we have seen once again, all of these concepts have been implemented with the support of the United Nations in communist China. Once again, if children are a resource to be managed by the almighty state, as the UN asserts, then parenthood is a privilege which the state can and must regulate. As Garrett Hardin correctly observes, quote, if parenthood is a right, then population control is impossible. This is one of the most important reasons why the UN works diligently to subvert the independence of families and to convince the public that parenthood is a state-created privilege. As we noted at the beginning of our presentation, the UN's designs are rooted in a religious vision of the global state as God, as the global state is the creator of our rights and the provider of our material benefits. From the American perspective, by way of contrast, individuals receive their rights not from the state, but from our Creator, God. And the state was created by man to protect God-given individual rights and to serve no other function. The UN's vision dictates that the powers of the state are unlimited and that individual rights are enumerated by the all-powerful state and subject to revocation without notice by the state. The American vision, by way of contrast, once again, is that the powers of the state are few and defined and that government is accountable to individuals for its actions. There can be no compromise between these contending visions, and the stakes in the struggle are nothing less than the happiness, prosperity, and freedom of you and your families, and the fate of human freedom on this planet. Fortunately, we have within our reach the means to defeat the United Nations and its masters and to recover our freedoms. To learn more about the ways in which you can help get us out of the United Nations